So welcome to the Mid-Hudson Library System's Real Property Tax Cap Refresher webinar. The tax cap has been in effect since 2011, but we notice we still get a lot of questions about the tax cap from member libraries. So we wanted to give everyone a chance to be reintroduced or perhaps refreshed in the information, and also help newer directors get a leg up on how the tax cap impacts their library. So I thought what we would do today is do just a basic run through of what is it, how does it work, how do you calculate the cap, how do you stay in compliance and make sure you don't run afoul of the Office of the State Comptroller, because they are able to come and audit you in terms of your compliance with the tax cap. Yes, even association libraries could be audited by the Office of the State Comptroller, but just in the area of the tax cap. So we want to make sure everyone's in compliance as we move forward and no one has any drastic financial consequences for not having complied, because it could really add up if you haven't been following their rules and regulations and reporting patterns. So just to get started here, there we go. So the tax cap law, as I said, was passed in 2011, and it actually went into effect June 2011. And it was super exciting for libraries because we weren't mentioned in the law at all. It didn't say the word libraries anywhere, but we were immediately told we were expected to be compliant with it, which meant we were reading a law that never mentioned us, so we had no idea how to comply with the law. So that meant for about a year of negotiations between the New York Library Association and the Office of the State Comptroller and the Department of Taxation and Finance to figure out how libraries fit into this brand new law they were trying to implement and regulate, which I think was a huge challenge for those working at the state level, just as it was a challenge for us here locally. So I served on the NYLA task force to straighten all of this out, and I think libraries ended up as well as they could in the framework of this law. So we'll cover where libraries fall in the law and how the different regulations in that law affect libraries. So we've been dealing with the tax cap now for, this is the fourth fiscal year that we've been complying in good faith with the tax cap law. I know some of you are a little worried because you might have missed reporting in year 1 or year 2. So we can talk a little bit about that, how to come into compliance and make sure you're not financially penalized. So when the law was passed, it was actually written to sunset in 2016, and we all were kind of like, oh, maybe this will go away next year. But in June of this year, they extended it through 2020. So we've definitely, this is the new reality for libraries for at least the next 4 or 5 fiscal years. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw it extended again beyond 2020. So I think it's something to just accept as a reality of fiscal planning at your library, and also to kind of integrate the reporting component of this into your annual compliance calendar of forms that you have to fill out, just like the annual report to the state, or for the public libraries when you file the OSC report. This is just another form that you have to file every year. And for all libraries that fall under the tax cap, yes, you do have to file every year, even if you didn't hold a vote that year or increase your tax levy that year. So we'll cover that a little more as we go through this morning's presentation. So there's actually 2 components to this law. One is specifically for school districts, and one is for what they call local governments. And they describe local governments as municipalities, so villages, towns, and cities, as well as counties. And they also mention districts, particularly special districts. And when we first kind of called up to the Office of State Comptroller and said, you're telling us libraries fall under this, but where? We were concerned because the school district side of the law is a little different than the local government side, and we'll explain how in a sec. But we advocated for libraries to be defined under the local government side of the law. We felt library structure most closely aligned with special districts, that how they were referring to special districts in the law. So we very early on got a ruling that libraries fall under the local government side of the law. And there's a very particular difference between the school district side and the local government side, which once you hear what it is, you'll be extremely relieved that you're on the local government side of the law. So if you hear people come to you and say, oh, but the school district does this, your answer is, but we don't fall under the school district side of the law, we fall under the local government side of the law. So everything that I'll teach you today is related to that side of the law, because that's very clearly where libraries land. So when we're thinking about which libraries are impacted by the tax cap law, we know a number of libraries were confused about whether or not association libraries fell under the tax cap. They do if they meet these two criteria, and it must be both. You have to have a separate, independent, elected or appointed governing board, and that really covers all public libraries in the state except for two, which are the Chatham Public Library and the Newburgh Library, because both of those libraries actually share a board with their school district. So they don't have a separate board. So therefore, they're part of the school's tax cap calculation. So every other library in the state has a separate board. But then we have to look at the second condition. Can you require a municipality or school district to levy a tax on your behalf? And all libraries have the ability to do this through a public vote, whether inherently as a school district public library or a special district library where you annually automatically have the right to go to the voters, and if they approve a budget, approve a tax levy that's being collected on your behalf by the municipality or the school district and passed along to you. And if you're an association library or municipal library and you're using Chapter 414 or the school district ballot option, also called 259, you also can require through that vote the municipality or school district to collect taxes on your behalf. So the way to just quickly think about it, you got your own board, you got your own public vote, you fall under the tax cap. That's a very clean and easy way to think about it. So when we think about what is the cap specifically, it's not a cap on your budget per se, it's a limit on the annual growth of real property taxes levied. So the actual tax levy portion of your budget is what is impacted by the tax cap, the property tax cap. So when you think about the variety of sources of income that you have, that's important to keep in mind. It's only about the amount levied through taxes to your local taxpayers. The cap itself is often referred to as the 2% cap, but I think many of us have figured out by now it's almost never 2%. It's not a literal 2%, nor is it actually 2% every year even to begin with, because it could also be the rate of inflation, also known as the Consumer Price Index or CPI. So the law very specifically says whichever is lower, 2% or the Consumer Price Index. And ever since 2013, it's been considerably lower than 2%, as many of you are familiar with. So it's actually been the lowest it ever has been this coming fiscal year. For libraries with a calendar fiscal year of January through December, it's 0.76%, so quite a bit lower than 2%. So I think this is an important thing for us to reiterate as we go through this morning. We're not talking about a literal 2%. It just has by default been referred to kind of in the way people like to refer to the tax cap as the 2% tax cap, but that's not in reality how the calculations work out. So I think that's an element of confusion for a lot of people that are trying to comply with the cap. So again, just to be super clear, calculation is not based on your budget, but on the amount of tax levied on behalf of the library at the local level. And it's only amount for the library. The library has a separate tax cap calculation, which I'll explain very thoroughly in just a minute. Like right now. Okay, so if the board, your library has its own board, its own vote, you have your own tax cap calculation. And this is something that we're still explaining, particularly to municipalities, that your efforts to move your library budget forward does not impact their cap calculation. Even for the 414 libraries, which is often where the confusion lives for the most part, town board will often think, well, since we have to pay the library's portion out of our budget, that would be a part of our tax cap calculation. But the Office of the State Comptroller, which occasionally I refer to as OSC, they're acronyms, so just bear with me if I do that, they very clearly said that libraries that meet those two conditions of a separate board and a separate vote have their own cap calculation. And there's very nice language you can copy and paste from the document you see linked at the bottom of this slide to send to your town supervisor or your town board who might be confused about how the library's finances fit into their finances in the area of the tax cap calculation. It's the same situation for libraries that are school district libraries or municipal and association libraries that use the school district ballot option or the 259 option. Even though the school district collects the taxes for you, they have their own cap calculation separate from yours, which is a very important distinction, particularly as we got through last year when we had the additional complication in terms of understanding how the property tax freeze would impact municipalities, school districts, and libraries. Libraries are like a separate entity, and that's important to hold your ground on that, because you don't want a school or a town board saying, well, because of the library, we exceeded the cap. That would never be the case. They are responsible for their own cap, and you are responsible for your cap. So before we mentioned that it's not a literal 2%, so you can't just take a look at your levy, take out your pocket calculator and say, oh, it's 2% of that, and then I should just keep my budget below that and I would be tax cap compliant. It's actually formula based, which is something that I think has thrown a lot of us into a tizzy when we first saw it, because it looks complicated. It has some terminology we might not be familiar with. But I think for those of us that have looked at the form and gone through it, this is calculated for you through an online form. So it's not like you're actually handwriting out this formula to calculate your cap. You're logging into an online form through the Office of the State Comptroller's website. I'll show you where that is. And you're plugging in one local number, and all other data is either already plugged in for you, or you're being supplied with it through the website within which you're filling out the online form. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to go into more depth in here with this formula. I'll make it a little bigger for you so you can see it. This is a lovely screen capture. You can download it for yourself on the Office of the State Comptroller's website, because I know you want to like laminate that and have it on your wall. But when we're looking through this formula and some of the language here, it might be a little confusing. So I just want to walk through it. And again, you don't have to do this calculation on pen and paper. It's just a way for you to understand what the elements are. So when we're starting in the top row there for the base formula, the prior fiscal year tax levy, that's the number you supply locally. That's the amount you received in local tax dollars to your library. So the amount that was approved by the voters, that particular dollar amount is what goes into that first field. The prior year reserve offset we'll talk about more in depth in a minute, but most of you will never, I hope, never face having to have the reserve fund. That's only if you had violated the override mechanism and asked for more money inappropriately. So I'll explain that a little more as we move forward. So that third element is also related to the fund, the reserve fund amount. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The tax-based growth factor is actually supplied for you from the Office of the State Comptroller. There's a chart where you'll look it up and plug that in. There's the PILOTS amount, which apply to some libraries, but not all. PILOTS is an acronym that stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes, which is often something that's negotiated on the county level or town level to encourage businesses to come into an area. And so instead of being charged the normal tax rate, they often negotiate a deal where they make what they call payments in lieu of taxes to the town, to the school, and to the libraries in many cases, so that there's some give back from the business to the community, but not at the same rate they would pay if they were paying the standard rate, which, however you feel about that, that is the way it is. Some libraries benefit greatly from that. Some other libraries have no pilots in sight that they're benefiting from, so that may or may not apply to you. The tort exclusion you see at the end of the first line of the base formula is again something highly unlikely to impact your library. That's related to litigation that you might be under if you are paying a settlement, and I really hope none of you are paying off on a settlement. So that's a very specific situation that if you found yourself in, let me know and I'll help you figure that out. But obviously I would probably know that you were there anyway, and we would figure that out very early on. So moving down to the second line, that transfer of function option, that is actually if you had merged operations with another local government, a municipality, a school district, another library, but you can't claim it. You can't say that, oh yes, we did this transfer of function and we're now saving this amount of money, so it would mean a reduction or rather an increase in our cap amount. They actually, the Office of State Comptroller has to come in and grade your effort of transferring a function of your business, your administration, or whatever it might be, with another organization. So it's not like a write-off on your taxes. It's actually an involved process that OSC comes in and does an investigation, and then they calculate the value of that merger, consolidation, or more symbiotic relationship you might have with another organization that is saving taxpayer dollars. In the exclusion areas, you'll see that tort issue appears again in the exclusions. And then the last thing you see there is related to the retirement system. So not all libraries are in the retirement system. For the most part, only public libraries are, municipal libraries, special and school district public libraries. And this is a nod to the fact that you don't control costs associated with the retirement system. And that if the contribution rates have gone over 2 percentage points, you get an exclusionary aspect to this formula, which again increases your cap because it's acknowledging you didn't control that amount and it's basically mandated. So that's the one area of mandate that is acknowledged in the formula to offset that aspect that you don't control. There's no other exclusions though for other things that you don't control. So that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So one of the things that, I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure we go back here for a second. I missed pointing out the allowable carryover in the middle line there, where you've got allowable levy growth factor minus pilots received in the coming fiscal year plus available carryover. And this is something that a number of libraries have benefited from in the past 4 years. The allowable carryover enables you that if you, in the year previous, you didn't use your full cap amount. So say in 2012, you did your cap calculation using that formula we just took a look at online, and it came out that your cap, your dollar cap amount, or let's use percentages just to be more realistic. Say the cap that year was 2%, and your dollar amount equaled 2% of your levy. And when your board took a look at that, they said, we don't actually need to ask the community for that amount. Let's just ask them for a 1% increase. That would cover what we need to do in the next year. So basically, you're leaving 1% on the table. You're not asking for a whole 1% that you could have gone to the community and asked for. Of course, they'd still have to approve it in order to get it, but they asked for less than they could have, which allows you to take that 1% you left on the table and carry it over for 1 year. So you could add that 1% into next year's calculation, and you can do that for up to 1.5%. If you had left 1.5% on the table, you could carry that over. So that's something to think about, particularly for 414 libraries. Just a reminder, we want 414 libraries to be going more frequently to the community to ask for increases to the budget so that you are closer to the percentages that align with the tax cap. And usually 414s aren't going to go every year. They might be going, as we see in Kinderhook, every other year or every third year. We're seeing in another community. You'll have potentially allowable carryover to add in. So you'll be that much closer to being cap compliant. It's still likely you're not going to be cap compliant, but it helps tell the story of how you're conservatively fiscally managing the library. So don't lose sight of the fact that you might have an allowable carryover if you're not going for a vote every year, or if you asked for a lower amount than you were allowed to the year before. So we get a lot of questions about overriding the cap, particularly for 414 libraries who don't go out annually and they find themselves looking at, 5 years potentially where they have not had an increase. And when they see the cap amount for this coming year is 0.76, that's not necessarily realistic for what they need to move the library forward. So there is an override mechanism, and this is used in those cases where the board sees a justified reason for asking the public for more than what the cap calculation says would be a cap compliant amount. So in order to do this, there's really just a one extra step the library board has to do, which is to pass an override resolution. And that has to be passed. There's 2 things to remember about this. You have to pass the override resolution by 60%. It would obviously, of the trustees, obviously be better if it was unanimous, so everyone understood the implications of what they were doing. But the law specifically says 60% of board members must agree to pass that override resolution. The second thing to remember about this is that that override resolution must be passed prior to the approval or the adoption of your final budget for the coming year. So for most of you, you might want to think about this of needing to have the override resolution done prior to your vote, well in advance of your vote. And also think about it as, making sure it's been done before the adoption of your budget. So if you're thinking about how would we know what we're going to be asking the community for, the board would have to see the budget. They'd have to know that the amount they need to ask for is over the cap amount. And then they'd have to pass the override first before they approved that budget to move through and then ask the community to increase the tax levy amount. If after your vote, You discovered, and we're going to talk about this at length because you might not actually know what your cap is at this moment when you have to put your budget forth or you have to make a decision about your 414 petition. You might have your board pass what we call a blanket override just in case their calculations are off. When they finally do get the numbers to calculate the cap from the state, they find out their math was off and they did go over. You want to make sure that override is in place no matter what. So you don't have to pull, try to pull an emergency board meeting together the night before your vote, or what you can't do is after your vote, then you're all done. There's no chance to do an override resolution after your budget vote. So you want to have the override resolution done before you approve a budget and absolutely before your vote if necessary, particularly if you don't have the data you need from the Office of the State Comptroller, which in many cases in public libraries is the case. I'm going to explain that more in a minute. If you did the blanket override and you did a good faith effort and your budget passed, and then you get your numbers from OSC in September and you find out that, oh, we actually were under the cap, the board can rescind the override resolution so that when you fill out the form for the Office of the State Comptroller, you can confidently say, no, we didn't override the cap. But if you had to, you would have been covered. So that's my better safe than sorry message to everyone, particularly 414 libraries, special district libraries that have a vote before mid-September, school district libraries that have a calendar fiscal year but have their vote in the spring, and let's see, 259 libraries who are often calendar fiscal year but their vote is in May at the same time of the school district. I'm going to go over that again in detail. So if you missed that part, don't worry. I have a whole table that explains that. So number 2 here, it's always by a simple majority whether or not you're overriding the cap or not. And this is the particular point of why it's important that libraries are filed under the local government side of the law and not the school district side of the law. The school districts have a similar situation for number 1, that their board has to approve an override, but that 60% falls under number 2 for a school district. Their public vote must pass by that supermajority of 60% in order to authorize the override. Whereas for a public library, it's still a simple majority, even if you're pursuing an override. So the other important point, number 3, when you fill out the annual form, be sure you indicate that you have overridden it or not. And I think we're about to talk about why that's important. Look at me, we are. We're going to talk about the reserve fund. So you'll see, and we noticed when we looked at the formula, there was a tax cap reserve function in, I think, 2 elements of the formula. That only applies if you went ahead and approved a request to your public at your public vote that went over your cap amount and your board never did the override resolution. They didn't do the blanket override resolution. They never did a resolution before they approved the budget amount that was going to be put forth before the public. If you basically what you're doing is you're illegally overriding the tax cap, which sounds strange, right? Because the public said yes. However, that resolution not being in place means you weren't actually authorized to ask the public for the amount that you did. And if that turns out to be the case and the Office of the State Comptroller comes and audits you and figures that out, you basically have to pay back the community plus interest for the amount that was over the cap amount that you received. So you'd have to set up a tax cap reserve. You'd have to put money in there from your budget that would cover paying back the community the amount between your request and the override amount, the cap amount and your override amount, plus interest that then pays back the community. And then until you do that, you can't override the tax cap again. That's my current understanding of how that would work. I think instead of me researching it further, it would just be best if we just all did it right. So if we all would just follow the override rules correctly, this would never be an issue for your library, hopefully. So compliance of this is actually, I think, more straightforward than we all thought it would be, which is, of course, respect of the override if your library is doing that, but to annually report your tax cap calculation to the Office of the State Comptroller. And you need that form to calculate your cap. So they tied those 2 things together. It's the same form to calculate your cap and report on whether or not you overrode the cap, which works if you're an actual local government, which is what the law was written for and which is what the Office of State Comptroller designed this form for, because a local government actually doesn't have a public vote on their budget. A local government decides on their budget, and by November 1st, the town board approves that budget. So they control the timeline of decision making for the budget and whether or not they're going to be under or over the cap. So Office of State Comptroller designed their process so they release the form and the data you need to calculate your cap in mid-September. So many of you are thinking to yourselves, and have already gone through this, that as a 414 library, you need to know your cap amount back in April when you're putting your petitions together, and you need to know if you need to do the override resolution. So that's why 414 libraries are all doing the blanket override, because you don't have the data you need when you need it. And then in mid-September, when you do find out, that's when you can decide whether or not you still need the override or not. But of course, your vote doesn't happen until Election Day, which is in early November. Luckily, the form isn't due until there's, I think, not clear instruction on this. Some say by the end of the fiscal year. I've seen other portions of their website where it says by November 20th. But we do know that all libraries have the ability to file that form after their vote, which is important. You wouldn't file that form until you knew if your vote had passed or not. So the form, and I think your peers will testify to this, is not as bad as you might think it is. It's not as scary as that formula slide that I showed you before. You're really inputting a minimal number of numbers, and it's spitting out your cap amount to you. You're indicating whether or not you overrode the tax cap or not, and you're done. It actually doesn't take very long to do. It's just the timing issue that I think makes it confusing for a number of libraries. So I do want to make this point, because we've had every single year we have a new director who is surprised by this, that even if you don't have a vote that year, if you're an association library, you didn't do a 414, you still have to file the form and indicate that you didn't exceed the cap. So every year you're reporting no matter what, whether there's a vote or not. And just think of it as actually a bonus to yourself, because you get that allowable carryover in your calculation the next year. If you haven't filed the form, there's no data for them to base your calculation on, which is, I think, a problem for, I think, those libraries who have discovered they didn't know they had to file the form the first few years. They've had to go back and retrospectively file those forms. So if you haven't filed the form, and I know there's one or two directors out there who just realized this year they should have been filing it and they haven't, just give OSC a call, let them know what happened. All reports back are that OSC staff has been extremely helpful in rectifying those types of situations, particularly if you've had no vote and you haven't increased your tax levy at all. It shouldn't be a problem. So this is what I was talking about in terms of when you get the data that you need to make your decisions and know if you have to do the override or not. You can see the very first line there is the fiscal year definition. So if it's January 1 through December 31st, that's called a calendar fiscal year. And you'll get, the form will be released, the data is available early to mid-September. It's also been late September, but regardless, you don't know until September. And for 414 libraries and many special district libraries, your votes and the decisions your board has to make happen well in advance of September, and therefore you don't know what your cap calculation amount is when you're making decisions about your budget, which just again reinforces that reminder to use the blanket override resolution to protect your library and your assets. As we said, you could always rescind that later on if you find out the library was able to come into compliance, but you want to have that in place no matter what. We had a library this year that did not do the override resolution and was caught very much by surprise when they found out the cap this year was going to be 0.76%. They had been anticipating something along the lines of last year, which was closer to 1.46%. So they actually thought they were going to be below the cap, but when that number came out this summer, they realized they had a problem, and they had to call an an emergency board meeting about a week before their budget vote, which was a special district vote, which caught the attention of the newspaper. And so the big headline 7 days before their public vote is library board calls special meeting to override the tax cap. And in 4 years of living under the tax cap, it's actually the first time we've seen a headline that said a library was going over the tax cap. Even though it's been happening fairly routinely, it drew the attention, and I think a lot of negativity to that library because of the timing of that issue. So I think if you just find your routine, find your pattern, once you got it going on, it's really not that big a deal from year to year. So I've alluded a couple times to these timing issues, and these are the situations that I've identified people are having timing issues with. So you can see here, special district public libraries, if your vote is prior to mid-September, obviously you don't have the data you need to make your decision, so that blanket override is going to be a factor. The school district public libraries, there's, I think, two issues that could be happening there. Some school district public libraries have a calendar fiscal year, and some have a school fiscal year, which runs from July to June. And so depending on which scenario the school district public library finds themselves in, the school districts get their data in time for their May vote. So if you're a school district public library who holds your vote around the same time and you have a school fiscal year, you actually get your data in time. But if you're a school district public library who has a calendar fiscal year and holds your vote back in May, you don't have the data in time. So that's very specific to those individual libraries' situation. The libraries that had the school district ballot vote, which is used fairly infrequently because it's extremely rare to have one library in a school district that could make use of that option. You often create double taxation issues with using that option. So there's a minimal number of libraries in Mid-Hudson who use 259, but for those that do, it's the same issue, that almost all of the 259 libraries have a calendar fiscal year, and your vote is almost always in May, going along with the school district. And again, you wouldn't have your data that you need at that time. So again, the blanket override is going to come in. That would be the easiest way to fix that situation. And the 414 libraries, you guys, there's really no solution for you. The blanket override has to happen because your board needs to make decisions within the second. I mean, if you haven't made the decision by the second quarter of the year, that's when your petitions have to start being signed. You need to know your dollar amounts by then, which means you have to make a critical decision about how much you're going for, and you won't have your cap calculation at that time. So again, the override resolution is the safest way to cover your library. So there are other long-term solutions to think about. So what I did was I created this chart. On the left are the 4 situations I just described. On the right, you'll see possible solutions. All of those situations should use the blanket override. There's in 3 of the situations, there's other things you might consider. A special district library could adjust their vote date. They could move the vote date, if depending on your legislation, to a time that is after when you would know what your cap calculation was. The school district libraries, again, you could adjust your vote date. You actually have the right to ask the school district to hold your vote at a different time and location. Like the Marlboro Library is a school district public library. They hold their vote in their library on a different date than the school district vote does. And that's very common in Long Island as well. So there's absolutely precedent for that if that would make your life easier. Same with the 259s. We haven't seen anyone try this upstate, but I think it's the same as the school district that you could request a different vote date. And if the school district is amenable, you could hold the vote potentially in your library or a town hall on a different date from the school district, or you may need to adjust your fiscal year. And that's what the Office of the State Comptroller would tell you if you called them and described this issue. And that was your situation, either of the school district public library or a 259. They're telling libraries to adjust your fiscal year, which is no small feat. It's a challenging thing to do. It's not that it hasn't been done before, but it's I think the most involved option or solution to fix this particular issue. 414 is really the only option, is the blanket override resolution. Again, rescind it if it turns out you didn't exceed the cap. So last year we had a lot of confusion because they introduced a new program called the property tax freeze on top of the tax cap. So most libraries had just barely kind of gotten the rhythm of the tax cap, and all of a sudden kind of a curveball was thrown at us. The state legislature approved a large amount of money to be used as tax credits back to homeowners in the state who were qualified. And that was tied hand in hand to the tax cap. So there's nothing to be done about the freeze at this point. The freeze compliance options fell into fiscal year 2015 mostly. If you wanted to get the credit for your community, and what the credit would be is if your library stayed below the cap but did increase the budget somewhat, the amount of that increase, as long as it was freeze compliant, meaning you stayed under the cap, that actual amount would be refunded to the homeowner by the state. So if your taxes the taxes for the library went up by $5, but that kept the percentage amount below the cap, the state would write a check for $5 to your homeowners, your residents in your service area, if you were freeze compliant. And being freeze compliant meant that in fiscal year 2015, you stayed under the cap, meaning the vote you held in 2014 to impact fiscal year 2015 was under the cap, That was the first requirement, kind of the prerequisite. And then year 2, your vote in 2014 to impact your vote in 2015 to impact year 2016. If that was also under the cap and you filed what was called a government efficiency plan, which would demonstrate a 1% savings over the next 3 fiscal years up to 2018, you could then trigger a second year of rebate to your residents. So at this point, libraries either have or have not complied with this aspect of this program. I will point out, and I don't have any more detail than what I'm about to tell you, is that when the legislature extended the life of the tax cap law, instead of ending in 2016, they extended it to 2020. At the same time, they also authorized another $1.3 billion for another tax rebate program. They did not call it the property tax freeze program. They only said a rebate program for taxpayers of New York. I don't have further details on how that might impact your library or if it will at all. It may be a whole different program they conceive of, but that's something I think we're going to have to be listening for to see if that would again impact us the way this special property tax freeze program impacted libraries. So the Office of the State Comptroller is the lead compliance department at the state level to ensure agencies are complying with the tax cap. The tax freeze, however, is overseen by a different department. It's overseen by the Department of Taxation and Finance. So you'll notice that the Office of the State Comptroller is having a webinar on October 7th. If you're interested, if you want to go even deeper than we've gone here today to learn about the tax cap, you can certainly go to one of the Office of the State Comptroller webinars. And we noticed that they coupled the tax cap and the freeze program into their webinar. And Kirsten and I both have attended the OSC workshops on the property tax freeze. And it's basically 4 slides that say it's not our job, it's the job of the Taxation and Finance Department. So if you're looking for freeze information, you'd be better going over to that end. But just for the everyday information you need about the tax cap, the Office of the State Comptroller is the place to go. This is that extremely long URL that I mentioned at the beginning that I'll be emailing you, so you can just click on it. Most of you have probably been there already. This is the portal where you go to file your form. It's where you go to find out what the new levy limit is. It's where you get that language you might need to send your town supervisor, proving that your cap calculation is separate from theirs. So I think that's really the go-to place to get information. It's certainly where I rely on to get information and to get more education about this. So I'll continue to obviously be on top of this and report back to the Directors Association about if there's any changes coming our way or what that new rebate program might be and how it might impact us. But I think as administrators and trustees, it's good to be familiar with this source material yourselves as well and be familiar of how to get help from OSC if you do run into a problem over the course of the life of this legislation, which again, like we said, is at least going till 2020, possibly far into the future beyond that. So I'm actually going to stop the recording now, and we're going to go into Q&A in case anyone has questions about what we've talked about here so far this morning.